think the way that we're going to start the first sort of session is just talking about Jasleen's work. I actually had a set of questions, but we're going to kind of throw them to one side because sort of today was actually the first time I saw Jasleen's work. We know one another because we've worked together on an Art on the Underground project where I was sort of working with Jasleen to deliver the latter part of an engagement project, essentially, for Art on the Underground. But how I wanted to begin was actually responding quite directly to my encounter of your exhibition this morning, and maybe using that as a way to draw out a conversation around some of the things that are important to you. So just to begin, just in terms of my first thoughts and the works that I was drawn to, perhaps the things that we can speak about I was really interested in marble busts. To me, it spoke about a particular type of lineage of sculpture, public art as well, and the history of busts in terms of who the figures that they depict from history. I was also interested in the materiality of the piece, and it was obvious also that there was a process that wasn't. There's a process that you had gone through to get to that final piece. So I wanted you to talk to me a bit about that because there was no information about who these three figures or busts or heads that we see, who they are. And then in contrast to that, seeing the Balti film, which was one of the three films that you have on show. And I was really interested in just my reading of that was that it took me to a very particular place, and I said earlier, of sort of BBC documentaries in the 70s and 80s, which explore particular immigrant communities. And you said to me, you mentioned, it was supposed to be an informative piece of a film. So there's just something there in terms of cultural translation and also sort of to what effect or what was sort of going on with that particular film. And then also just this idea of materials. So I really like the two sculptural pieces on the floor, cans. And I just wanted to talk a bit about sort of that relationship with materials and how you use them, because also in the way that you present or you've curated the selection of works that are presented is really interesting. You use vinyl as a backdrop in two pieces. And then there's also a punctuation of the physical space with your beaded curtains. So in that sort of small space, because it is quite a sort of modest exhibition, there's actually a lot of things to unpack. And maybe, let's perhaps start with marble busts and talk about how that project started.
Yeah, so Marbled Busts was a commission for the Jerwood makers. And maybe I should just say, practically, I didn't have a so that was 2015. And I didn't have a studio. I graduated from the RCA in 2010 and didn't work from a physical, whatever you call a studio space, up until the Jerwood makers. And I was still making work up until that point. Balti would have been 2014, there was work being made. And I think that I applied to the Jerwood makers because I wanted to, there was two really on a practical level. I wanted to make something using a material that wasn't found matter, because I in the past relied a lot on found material and still do, love using found materials. And the subject was kind of maybe something that I was thinking about a lot. So the piece came about because I work in the V&A quite a lot, running workshops, schools workshops. And the Sculptor Corridor, when the building work started being done, they shut down. So you've got the Sculptor Corridor, which is Western European sculpture, and then there used to be an offshoot that went to the cafe, and that would have been Asian sculpture. And I guess I'm always interested in those meeting points of things, and that was for me a physical meeting point, but also how it changed so much. You've got these marble busts of mainly men, and they are things which you definitely don't touch. And you know that they, well, at least for me, they come from a certain time, place, when people were kind of, you're almost making a monument out of a man. And they are to a monumental scale. So they're like 20% bigger than life size. Right. So there's all of this kind of reading of an object that you just take for granted because you walk that corridor about 20 times a day. And then what is Indian sculpture? So within the museum, it would be religious sculpture, Buddha, things which kind of had a different function. And that was my first starting point about how when you go to a mandir or you go to, in India, sculptures of that kind of nature, they are used, they have a function, they are touched, they have a life in a way that the other sculptures that, so it was a really simple kind of start point. And so I wanted to make a series of sculptures that, well, the three people were a kind of meeting point of these two separate things. So they are three, happen to be men that, for me, kind of cross these cultural boundaries. So there's my great granddad with the little dopey little hat. Okay. I won't go into depth of each piece, but he moved to Glasgow in 1950 from Ludhiana, Punjab, and the only pictures I've got of him, he doesn't have a turban on, but he was this pioneer in my mind, and he passed away like a month before I was born. It was at the same month I was born, and there's a kind of I'm always mining that personal history. I'm always really interested in finding out more about that initial move and that impetus 3 years after partition. What is it what's going on in the mind of him that makes that move, and therefore is the result of me being born in Glasgow. There was Edward Said, a writer, somebody that by chance at the Glasgow School of Art, I was turned on to his writing by an amazing tutor. And all of his, he calls himself an in-betweener. So it's, I guess, all of his narrative and my relationship with him. And then there was Napier, Lord Robert Napier, who might come up on the screen, which was from a previous project. And it wasn't intentional, but there seemed to be a bit of a timeline going on. So there was the start point, 1950s, a kind of a moment for me as a practitioner in finding some kind of area to work within and some kind of context. And I try to read a lot, and writings inform a lot of my academic writing, informs a lot of like the bedrock of what I work on, and then how I operate as an artist. Maybe it wasn't intentional, but that was and I had to pick three for funding reasons.
Okay.
You know, I could have made 10.
I was going to ask you why 3.
Yeah, I could have.
Okay.
So that some practicalities come into it, and they're marbled plastic. So there is, I don't know if you know, outside pound shops or hardware shops, these marbled plastic buckets. It was me wanting to mimic that and talk about value and the hierarchy of material. And my dad owns a hardware shop, so it's playing on all of that language that I've inherited in a way.
And there's definitely, I think this is something that exists throughout all of your work, these kind of layerings of sort of histories or a questioning of histories. I love it because I wasn't sort of completely aware of the fact that actually the third sort of bust was of Edward Said. So that very clearly, for me, starts speaking about sort of what you're trying to do in terms of, bringing these conversations sort of onto sort of, he's someone that spoke sort of, his life's work was about sort of the colonial subject and looking at sort of the colonial project and then sort of taking it to the personal by sort of your grandfather's story sort of within sort of this larger, history, and then sort of Lord Napier. What I am sort of interested in is just aesthetically, though, you've sort of very much, the way it's presented does sort of uphold a very particular type of Western way of like presenting sort of works. And I thought what was interesting was there was a real questioning going on in terms of sort of, you saw this at the V&A and, you wanted to kind of respond to that particular way of presenting certain figures from history, yet you still use the same language.
Yeah.
And I know sort of part of that's destabilised by sort of the material that you use and, you know, talking about value. And I just wanted you to just respond to that. It might be that it might not have been a concern, but just in terms of using a sort of a Western kind of museum language of presenting, because you said something very beautiful about, you go to the Mandir, the Hindu temple in India, and you have these busts, but they're touched. And this idea that you've presented something that actually I walk into that space and I, you know,
don't want to touch them.
Well, I know that I kind of can't because I understand.
You can.
The codes. Oh, you can? Okay. But the codes and language of being in a gallery. And I
work outside of that a lot, and maybe maybe before I come back to the bus, like bring in the film Balti, because that's a kind of almost like it's the remains of another, or it's one part of a bigger project. So that video was filmed on an iPad by a good friend and art photographer, Rachel Louise Brown. And the project for me was documenting the process of langar being made, which happens in the gurdwaras every day. But in order to equip myself with because I cook a lot, and cooking has been a part of my practice for quite a long time. And there's a thing about, I guess it was an offshoot from the Tala curry measure, which was a product for cooking a meal for a family. But it was scaling that principle up into buckets, industrial buckets, because in the Gurdwara they cook on an industrial scale. And I know that those recipes, you know as well, that those recipes aren't written. They're not followed. You know, the people, the volunteers, the sevadars that meet and cook in the morning aren't following a written recipe. It's another kind of knowing. And so I wanted to equip myself with that knowledge. I often think about, because even my mum wouldn't know how to go and cook for 300 people. Like, there's certain key people in the community that know how that works, and then it all functions. And so it's a little bit about documenting something that is really important. But a lot of what I've made in the past is equipping myself with objects or tools that then allow for something else to happen. So these buckets were big Tala curry measures, essentially, that had all the increments that I needed to then go and re-cook that meal, which is what happened. So at some point, the project kind of, yes, there's this video, but actually whenever the video was screened, which I've not done it. When I screened the video, the first kind of iteration of it was screening it out the back of a zip van, which is these hire vans that you can get in streets in London. So built a cinema screen that slotted into the back of a transit van, and then screened the video but cooked the food as well. So the process of how I work there is not in a gallery space, and so some of what I do is just figuring out stuff. So I was trying to go back in my head to when I was thinking about presenting the marble busts, and because I did think about I wanted them to be manufactured in a bucket factory. That wasn't going to happen. And I thought, okay, so what if I have 30 and even the bad casts are there? Or what if I have them all in? But then sometimes reducing it's like editing or writing.
Yeah.
What needs to be there and what doesn't. And in that instance, I felt like they just had to be on a wall. And yeah, it does tap into how things are traditionally seen. But maybe it was deliberate because the material is typically not valuable. It's bloody expensive, I'll tell you that. But yeah, so yeah, there's always like a negotiating. And the space as well, it being in the Jerwood, of how you want something to be seen or read.
And then going back to the Balti piece, is there a way you'd want that film to speak to an audience? Because, you know, I told you sort of the initial response I had, I was aware of the fact that it again was part of a sort of bigger project as well. But just even in terms of, I was trying to just understand the, where you stood, because there was sort of lovely moments when there were people sort of looking back and grinning at you, just knowing that you were filming, and it really sort of reminded me of amateur sort of Indian videos, wedding videos, where you'd have videos when they were first readily available, and you'd usually get your uncle to film sort of someone's, your kind of wedding, and there'd be sort of long pans of the dining hall and just people awkwardly grinning to the camera. So this is, again, me sort of, reading quite a bit into the sort of, the aesthetic of the film and the way that it's shot. But I think, I just want to kind of, unpack that a bit more. Like, was it an afterthought, or part of a bigger project, or were you playing with those sort of cinematic and sort of cultural kind of histories of how
there's no
communities have been?
There's no way I could have, so that it was done on such a tiny kind of scale. It was me in my back pocket and saying, Rachel, can I pay your ticket to come up to London? Auntie, I want to cook. Can we all meet on this day? And what time does the lunga get? That was not a funded project. So the scale of it was small, which might just be an incidental thing to remember. But me working with the very community that I grew up with is a bit of a tension as well. Like, there's a reason why I keep going back to that and keep bringing in family members or keep bringing in the wider community, because it is an ease, but also there's a kind of barrier there. Where am I going with this? So it's not fully understood why I am there doing this thing, and that discussion and that conversation about why is partly the reason why I bother, so that there can be that conversation happening. And so the deliberateness of the editing, and I'm not a filmmaker, and that was a kind of process of me, and Rachel is not she does a bit of editing, but it was a process of us working together. It's got quite a kind of like naivety to it, the whole thing, and it's a project that I like, and I return to a lot, because and I think that's with a lot of work, even the shoes that were made in 2009. There is certain work that it's like moss. What's that saying? Yeah, anyway. Gathering moss, got it. Yeah. It kind of layers of meaning depending on where I am in my life or practice, or who's looking at it, or what context it's seen in. It kind of gathers meaning, so I'm enjoying that you're seeing something in it that wasn't intended. But coming back to video, so when my mum came to visit, she's not in the room, is she? She didn't come, did she? When my mum came to see the exhibition, she found it quite a struggle. So to quote her, art isn't for people like us. And she said it to me years ago, and it really stuck with me. So in the exhibition, she struggled to kind of look at the sculptures or the objects, but she was comfortable enough to sit and watch the videos. Maybe that's because she features in two of them. And I'm kind of playing with that to me, I'm attracted to the medium of video at the moment, because there's something about, and I think we talked about it before, that something about the kind of ease, or the knowing, how to read something. It's like picking up a book and not knowing how to read the language. She knows to sit down and watch it, and this is not me being patronising. I think art does that to a lot of people, or the gallery space does that to a lot of people. And they are a bit of a litmus test for me, my family, because I mine so much from them and from our relationship and the whole wider inherited culture. And so there is a bit of me that there's a lot of me that has always wanted me to be able to take the work, or bring them to the work, or take the work, for the work to be fluid enough to operate in different situations. Yeah. For it not to, I remember the chai tea stall project from when I was studying at the RCA. I always, the way I was writing about it or talking about it was, it should be able to operate within the RCA at the degree show. I should be able to serve Ja there in that space, but I should just be able to wheel it and put it in Southall, and it should be able to operate there. And it was a really like key point at the very beginning of something where, I guess it's a bit of a metaphor for me, maybe, I don't know, but I think, and my great granddad maybe as well, but this transcending of spaces or class or, and that comes within, the art gallery as well, like formal and non-formal, out in the street.
Yeah. I was just thinking, because I had like a set of questions, but this is actually
more interesting.
More interesting. What came to mind is this sort of, this always, the idea of the biography and sort of your families, telling these stories through sort of your family history. I'm really interested in the idea of slippages within your work. May they be slippages in sort of cultural translation or mistranslation, and also slippages in material. So you really embrace this, exploration of the language of materials and how far you can push them, and talking about value as well. And also this idea of creating situations. That's something that curatorially I'm really interested in. This idea of creating situations which involve like a network of social relations, but also are about expanding sort of how and where art exists, in the everyday. I just wanted to kind of maybe ask you a bit more about something like, the chai tea stall, which you made in 2010, which for me, like looking back at your sort of biog and the projects that you worked on, was a moment where you were moving away from, I think the thing to say is you started as a jewellery designer, you went to the Royal College of Art, and what were you studying there again?
Jewellery.
Jewellery again.
Underhand stoffer.
Yeah, but sort of the way you were approaching, I'd argue you were never really interested in sort of jewellery making in terms of sort of adornment and, wearing things. So just that sort of inquiry that was taking place, and I see sort of 2010 and that move to, not only creating a situation, but sort of taking the work outside of the gallery or institute. And that's kind of continued through the projects that you've worked on in museums and galleries as well, so with various communities. And because I've been thinking quite a bit, quite literally responding to, the title of the conference, Thinking, Making, Matter. And I was like, well, actually, I'm more interested in sort of matter making thinking. So, the other way around. And just, within your own practice, I was thinking, okay, so what is it that really sort of matters? And, what is your relationship with matter as well? Because that seems to be somehow key. And that's just for you to kind of respond in like any way you want.
Matt, what? Maybe I want to start back at jewellery. So, I studied jewellery at the Glasgow School of Art, and a lot of this stuff, or the journey of my art practice, is depending on who I've met and who's put me on a certain path, and in a way that I'm really thankful for. So my amazing art teacher, Mrs. Hempstead, who's no longer with us at high school, recognised that maybe I had a skill in making with my hands and that I should apply to this course. This was, I wasn't allowed to go to art school. I was meant to be studying pharmacy. There was people who were always championing me to kind of do the next thing. So, went to Glasgow School of Art, made jewellery. The same, I would argue, the same themes were being explored. So, Ranjana, who I met and introduced me to Orientalism as a concept or as a theory, and Edward Said was just so like pivotal for my head. She suddenly made me realise that everything I was trying to do at the workbench in the studio, she was able to kind of give me the like the meaty bit of that. So I was still dealing with the same subjects. I was just making jewellery, and began to make jewellery that wasn't jewellery, that was just an object, and deliberately went to the RCA, and in my interview said, I don't want to make jewellery anymore. And luckily, I don't know if anybody knows Hans's work or the department, but it's really broad thinking. And so I never made a piece of jewellery again. I was making objects, and began maybe coming into the reason, or the thinking about matter or stuff. Started to really intuitively just use a lot of found material. So the perfect timing, thanks shoes. Like I remember this period of time being so rapid. Like my output was huge. There was no fear of making.
And this was during your time?
This was RCA, yeah,
okay.
The 2 years. It was amazing. And there was like no kind of, and I think this is the culture that Hans grew, and the department and the people and the peers and me moving out of home, and a lot of things I think contribute to that. But there was just this rapid production of stuff. And maybe looking back at that, it was about using, I like to play and subvert and play with people's associations or reading of a thing. So it's kind of like, it's just another language, or tapping into people's knowledges of what something is. And yeah, also, we don't really want to talk about Pitt Rivers for much, but when I went to Pitt Rivers Museum early on, when I was moved to London, it kind of like worked with my thinking that you can put a cup from your kitchen cupboard there, and then a cup from another country, group of people, blah, blah, next to it. And because you know what that cup is, your reading of that cup is going to be, there's a connection between those things. And there was something about objects that seemed to speak universally, maybe, or have that agency to do that, which was maybe a reason why I felt like I just wanted to take the stuff from around me rather than remake it. So that's where Jerwood came in as something different, because I was remaking something from scratch in a way. And then, yeah, using it to... I just think it was such a kind of, like a great time to free think. And so the chai tea stall, or calling up Lord Robert Napier to meet him and have Dad tie a turban on his head, there was no kind of worry about... It was really instinctive. The whole thing was really instinctive. And I think it's years later that I do the reflective bit.
Yeah.
And think about, yeah, there's a kind of, I like the naivety of not knowing what you're doing. It's like with Tala as well. I'm not a product designer, but somehow managed to get a phone number for the director of Tala and give him a call and say, I've got this idea. So there is this spontaneity, and if I think back to what was going on 6 years, and what year are we in? 7 years ago. I might need you to prompt me to get me back on course.
No. Because it's just made me think about, your sort of working processes and how you approach projects. But also, if we go back to that sort of idea of slippages, and I was thinking about it in terms of materials and the materials speaking themselves, and, when you speak about sort of these projects, I'm interested in the sort of slippages in terms of kind of the there's something around value that kind of, you come back to again and again, and it's just there in the work, and sort of in the materials that you choose. But also, are you worried about sort of slippages in terms of like how your work's translated? We've spoken about this and sort of touched upon this
really
a bit more, before.
I was thinking about it last night actually, about those slippages, and I couldn't help but think about, because I live in London at the moment, since I moved there, I would say every day, if I'm interacting and not by myself in the studio, I'd say every second day someone comments on my accent. I don't think if I moved back to Scotland, that'd be one thing I'd miss, Helen, but people commenting on my accent. They don't expect, like, it's really, really it happens so often where I'm speaking and they'll stop hearing what I'm saying and just be like, oh, I didn't expect. I've actually had in the V&A, your accent doesn't match your face. And
wow.
I just took it as a compliment. So yeah, what you see isn't always what you get, maybe, or things like with the Lord Robert Napier project. So just to fill everyone in, the guy with the turban on, his great granddad fought in the British Indian Army at the time of the British Raj, but specifically he was an army general in the wars between the Sikh army and the British Indian army in Punjab. So there was two wars, they're called the Anglo-Sikh Wars. And his great-granddad has a statue erected just outside the RCA, which was my way of encountering him, because I Googled him and I read about his great-granddad on Wikipedia and found out that an artist 10 years ago had wrapped the statue in red tape. And so I wanted to tie a turban on the statue, and I had 3 months to go before the degree show, and it wasn't going to happen because the statue sits on the boundary line of 2 boroughs, so if I wanted scaffolding up I had to do everything twice, or you had to ask for everything twice, permission for everything twice. Part of that, speaking to the conservationists at the RCA who helped manage that previous artist project, they had all of the letters to the current lineage, so the current Lord Robert Napier, because they need to get the okay from him. And so it became, well, if I can't tie a turban, wouldn't it be brilliant if I tied the turban on him? Because that takes the conversation to a present day, and it's me as somebody, anyway. And yes, the chance of that photograph coming out in that way, where his look is kind of, we didn't ask him to pose, you know, so there's a comedy to it. You look at it and you could laugh. There's a guy with a pink turban on his head. I would laugh, maybe. But there is all of this stuff that comes with it. And so, yes, and I'm not a comedian. Right? My intention with the shoes or with Napier or with recent video Europe, which has definitely got a kind of joyfulness to it, is not... I think there's a politeness to I think I've used that word once before, and it seems to sum up how I am maybe as a person. There is a kind of, there's a not, the work isn't angry, but I think there is definitely an attempt to deal with a whole set of political histories, current things that are going on now. It's layered.
Yeah. I mean, I really sort of liked what you said about sort of not knowing, you know, and that always being the way in which you work. But there's certainly a knowingness in, you know, how these things kind of might translate. Yeah, and I find that interesting as well. I wanted to kind of now maybe just talk about a sort of current film that a very recent film that you made, Europe, which kind of goes back. We seem to be talking about the V&A quite a bit, and I don't know how that's happened, but, you know, it was part of a commission, a much sort of larger commission, and you were invited by the V&A. And just in terms of those sort of, sometimes those kind of contentious histories, I'm interested in how, you know, what the invitation was from the V&A, why you decided actually you wanted to sort of deal with that, and this idea of interrupting or kind of destabilising maybe sort of the museum, and somewhere like the V&A, which has a very sort of particular sort of history of, you know, supporting kind of making and you know, and thinking as well, but through a very particular kind of lens. You know, it's the sort of original kind of museum in many ways. And I just want you to maybe talk about that. Yeah, so the commission was collecting Europe, and it was a series of 12 artist commissions, artist, designer, maker commissions, and it was an invitation to put in a proposal, so that I'm not sure how many applications they looked through. And I didn't think, and that's besides the point. It was
a few weeks after Brexit that I got this email, but I found out later, just the other week when the exhibition was on, that this has been a project of because it was supported by the Goethe Institute and the British Council. It's been a project of the Goethe Institute for 2 years, so the timeliness was kind of added a whole new meaning to it. And it was, the brief was to think about, consider Europe in 4017. How are we going to remember Europe, this thing? And so my response was to make a video of Europe that was made up of all of the shots of when they film in European locations from popular Indian cinema. So to make this almost like a collage of Europe that is, in fact, you know, it is of Europe, but from a particular lens, in this case, Indian cinema. And maybe think a little bit about the perpetuation of stereotyping. So I guess I think, well, India is stereotyped, it's simplified down, it's this romantic country, and it's been stereotyped throughout history. So, and similarly, like the footage that I was collecting and my association to Indian films growing up was, you know, they're 1 minute in Delhi, and then the next minute they're cavorting on a Swiss Alp somewhere, and the narrative doesn't take you there, they just jump. And so there was something going on about an aspiration to the West, about associating to the West, which I could relate to a lot with my own family and that experience, but also a getting it wrong, or a getting it right, I don't know, but just the, like you say, the slipperiness of how something is represented. So when Shah Rukh Khan is busking in London in Trafalgar Square, it was so awkward to watch. I'd always laugh at those bits in the films because it was, you'd expect it, you'd know that within that 10-minute sequence of song, they're going to jump country in a minute, and you're just waiting for it, and it's kind of cringy, but so yeah, I wanted that to be the focus, that depending on what lens you're viewing this thing from, whatever it may be, that there's an area of getting it wrong, or it being misrepresented in a way. And with the context of the V&A, I think I said earlier, you weren't at the talk actually, but I love and have issues with the V&A. I think that it brought another meaning to the work, which I like, because it sits within the exhibition was screened on the ceiling of the medieval galleries, and I guess in a building that attempts to narrate the histories of so many cultures and countries and subjects. I think it was also attempting to do that in a way, or maybe holding a mirror back up at the place that it was situated within.
Maybe.
And
I was going to say, it might be a good moment to actually watch it, because we thought that would be quite a nice way to, you know, have a sense of what we're talking about.
Good idea. Maybe I could just say while you're getting up, Europe is Google translation of Europe, EUROPE, into Hindi, so it's spelled YOOROP.
I was just thinking about this idea of sort of an idyllic kind of nature and that sort of relationship between sort of migrants and land as well. That was just, something that was sort of coming to mind. But I forget how much of it's, a bit of a kind of lyrical kind of journey about sort of, or visual journey about sort of migration as well, just sort of reading it sort of back again. I just wanted to, so I don't know so much about, just in terms of the narrative that you were trying to sort of draw out. So it would be good to just hear a bit more about
within this
that.
film.
Yeah.
So the process was finding the footage first of all.
Okay.
And there was.
I mean, I'm also interested in sort of why Bollywood actors and, actually sort of seeing it again, they all kind of look like lonely figures as well, a bit out of place in these sort of strange environments. So just in terms of sort of, this idea of actually this is kind of what things could be like, in sort of the future, was that it, or was it about problematizing?
So it started with me proposing that this would be a future where the East is writing about the West, whereas it's always been the other way around. I think it's developed since then. And maybe I can talk a bit about the process. So the process of finding this footage and then figuring out, it's quite similar to how I work with objects, cutting and pasting. It was that same process that I worked with an editor and artist, Mariana Simnett. And the process of editing was, there was I got really annoyed about the gender stereotyping when I was gathering this footage, where the woman was always this sexualised body and the man would always be the hunter. In a way, it's so apparent in every single video that I was gathering. And so there was a feeling of, I want to remove all of those kind of close-up shots or the really sexual dance scenes or the whatever. And so there was, first of all, the editing was stripping all of that out, and which makes you take a slightly removed position in the video. You're never really with a person too long. There's a few moments, but there's not a sense of knowing the characters or the people. So I think that it was also like I was working with this found material, so it took the arc of a day, or it felt right to put it within the arc of a day. I wanted to, that was again a very instinctive decision, but how do you hold someone's attention when you, because this was video is not I'm not trained in video, so it was, I wanted to be able to hold someone's attention and make this kind of journey. And so there was overnight, after leaving Mariana one night and going back in, I was like, I think it needs to start with the countryside, and I think it needs to start with these people journeying into these cities, and then I think it needs to get closer in, and then there needs to be this hive of activity. But that was me responding to what stuff I had to work with, which I really enjoyed. And something that comes from it when I'm even just watching it now is that blurring of boundary lines, and what Indian cinema does from the start. That they don't tell you that they're going to go to Switzerland or London in a lot of videos. It's just this kind of, it just jumps there. And that's, thinking about where we are now, that's interesting. It is this one land, and it is this one land. It's not. And the people are moving very, very freely and moving out. And I think that I can only help but think about politically where we are now. And I think that's what we do when we look at stuff, though. We come with another type of understanding or knowledge, or where we are at that time and place.
Yeah. So just as a sort of last question before we open it up, and hopefully there'll be sort of more questions. It was just in terms of how it was read then, because we started our conversation by talking about this and sort of, the container of, that is the V&A, and I'm just interested in how sort of, when it was sort of, it was projected on a ceiling, just in terms of the things that we've spoken about, how that then kind of translated to the audience's experience, or how what was sort of the audience? Is all friends and sort of people you know who have visited? What?
There was... So it was on the ceiling, so you were lying down on a bit of fake Axminster carpet to lie and watch it, or you could watch it from the peripheries of the room. It's maybe worth mentioning that it was in a room called Noble Living, room 10A. Okay. And there was something that it wasn't...
Did you choose that?
No, it was actually suggested, and I'm so glad it was, because I was in my mind wanting to make this circular lens, like cut the film so that it was a circle. So when it was projected on the ceiling into this circular architecture of the building, it was image mapped to the building shape. So you didn't see the black outline, it was just this circle, which was, I guess, a reference to the lens, but also felt like a bit of a friend said it looked like a portal, because you had this video, and then on this wall you had a massive tapestry full of people, and there was a nice relationship with it and the things in the room. It had a conversation with the things in the room, and coming back to Noble Living, me thinking about this footage and this desire to associate with the West, and that kind of I was thinking about soft power as well, like Bollywood or Indian cinema as one of India's soft powers, and its reach is global. And so was it a deliberate move for directors like Yash Chopra to film within locations that the people there are going to be watching it, you know? And I've got friends from Switzerland that have memories as kids of seeing colourful bodies, like I mean colourful as in orange saris, dancing about on the hillside. So that I wonder whether that is also a part of its kind of the thing that interests me. It is something that interests me in it. But sorry,
no, it's almost it has come full circle, just back to sort of your exhibition, just in terms of how you frame the experiences of, you know, the audiences, and all of it's done. There's not only sort of a layered kind of approach to your process, but there is in the way that you frame the work eventually. May that sort of be on the back of a van that sort of travels through London, you know, showing a film, or, you know, the sort of your auto trader position sort of behind a pebble dash like vinyl. So all of, you know, going back to that sort of idea of kind of unknowing when in your process, but a sort of very knowing kind of approach in terms of how you then situate the work. I think that's, you know,
in an accessible kind of way, or
in both really. Just that, you know, the audience is always there. The audience is always in mind as well. That the more I'm getting to know your work, the more I'm sort of understanding those relationships you set up with the audience, or the people, the communities that you're working with, or your family, and how you bring them in.
I think it started with the family, but I think it's developing into something much more, for me, much more interesting, like a project with the project I'm working on now, to do with Warli painters in rural India, in Byre, which was a project I was out in India for in January, which was one of those kind of formats of 5 artists from the UK going to work with artists from another culture, and for there to be meaningful exchange, whatever that means. And me, I think I'm at a point where, as somebody who's run a lot of workshops and has got a bit of a CV for socially engaged practice, thinking about what that actually is. And why I'm thinking about that in terms of what you've just said is that I think I'm being, within that project, being a little bit more critical about what that is, what a socially engaged practice is, and how I responded to that project, which was actually not to engage much at all. I really stepped back, and I'm producing another video this time, using it as a project to edit myself, to kind of grapple with the cut and paste of editing. But I'm really thinking about what the viewer is going to see in a way that I don't think I've really considered it before. Maybe because there is all this politics of that project, and I'm wanting to present a set of questions rather than package it all up neatly and present a project, which I don't think I'm ever I'm ever interested in doing. There's not this kind of, it's the same with the exhibition here. There's so much more. There's this day, there's a publication, there's a meeting and talking with you, there's a meeting and talking over breakfast and over a whiskey last night. You know, for me, that is all part of this commission. It's not solely the objects in a room. That's not the end point for me at all. But I only learned that in doing it. So yeah, I wouldn't know otherwise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? Got one over there.
Yeah, good question. So that was composed for the piece by a composer called Leo Chadbourne, also goes by Simon Bookish. He's wonderful, and I'm so glad that I had A, the budget, and B, somebody put me in touch with him. So we worked together, and then he kind of went off, and he's such a talented musician, composer. And the brief, I guess, for him, from me, and it very much was a collaboration, but I didn't want it to be an Indian sound. I didn't want it to be placeable. Like, I don't think there's a time reference or a place reference to the sound. When I was getting the rough edits together, I watched it to Steve Reich, which was, he's minimalist composer, but makes quite cyclic music, which kind of added up with me wanting to put something cyclic to it, and that taps into, I'm really interested in Indian classical music, and there's something called a jugalbandi, which is just a great word anyway. But it's a type of performance where it can be like an hour long, and you've got a percussion, tabla, somebody on a string, and you'd have the tanpura, the drone in the background, and the person on strings would play something quite cyclic for the tabla to play this hour-long performance. It's almost like a conversation, but I thought that it would work with the rhythm of the video. And so it was a kind of cutting and pasting of Indian classical, but I quite liked that was kind of Steve Reichy. And then there was a harmonium used in it. So there's keyboard, harmonium, and synths. And the harmonium is an instrument which originates from Europe. It was, I think, if I'm right, it was invented by a German person. And it started as an upright, almost like an upright piano, but smaller. And then my association to a harmonium or a vajra is, I grew up playing it from I'm probably younger than 3. And it's small and it's squat and it sits on the floor, and to play it you sit cross-legged on the floor. And I quite like that evolution of an object, of an instrument, and how it is the most widely used instrument in India now. People do play, but it's much easier to play the harmonium than it is to master a sarangi or a sarod or another. So I was just interested in things shifting their place of origin, and so bringing it into the video as a European instrument that's also kind of Indian. So yeah, all of those slippages. But he wrote the piece to the video, which was great because it kind of takes you on this journey.
Any other questions?
Oh, did I? You've just made me remember my first day at the RCA and Hans Stouffer making us all present our summer projects and saying, before you present your summer project, tell me what you are. And so I think I called myself a thinker. I can't quite remember. But yeah, we're constantly being told to call ourselves something, and I can't help but think that comes from actually not the people on the ground doing the work. It comes from education, and it comes from markets like art markets and people and galleries, and it comes from somewhere else. I'm just not interested in those labels, really. I'm more interested in the content of someone's work or who they are as a person. But you do need to promote yourself Well, you don't, but I do. I do promote myself currently as an artist, but seem to get quite bored of labels, so maybe something else in a week's time. It's a very conscious decision to just call myself an artist, but I think it's taken me years to get to the point where I've dabbled in design, and I've dabbled in lots of I call it like jumping on the back of other audiences. So operating during the London Design Festival with my van and a massive pot of curry was just another opportunity to have a social space. And so I'm constantly looking for the right context, I think. I think that's the thing that makes me consider where I put work or what I then define myself as, rather than defining myself as something and then working within that area, if that makes sense. Good for time. I'll need to write that down after. Thank you.
I mean, this is just my sort of parting comment. It really reminded me of when I kind of probed you about this when we initially started speaking, and you said something along the lines of it's actually sort of curators and people like me who are interested in those labels, and it's true, even though I spend sort of, half my kind of curatorial life sort of trying to undo that, but that's so sort of, so, just in terms of invitations that you have, I'm sure that kind of plays out in terms of how people sort of either see you, and it's quite telling, or, if those invitations come from like the craft or sort of all the contemporary art world, but essentially what, your response was, well, actually I find those conversations sort of quite sort of boring, and it's the project and it's the actual invitation. Yeah. That's really, what's important. Yeah. So, yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanprit.